Good afternoon and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Stan Veuger. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. I'm delighted to welcome my friend Yascha Mounk back to AEI for a conversation about his new book, The Great Experiment: Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. Here it is. Now go buy it. Today's event is part of the Edward and Helen Hintz book forums at AEI. These forums provide a platform to host prominent authors for discussion of their forthcoming books on issues of national significance. We're very grateful to Edward and Helen Hintz for their tremendous support of AEI and deep commitment to our mission. Now, today's book, Yascha's book, is about the governance of multi-ethnic, pluri-religious, or otherwise diverse societies, draws lessons from history, social psychology, and comparative politics that point toward the possibility of difference without fragmentation and harmony instead of hierarchy, or so Yascha argues. The terrorist attack in Buffalo on Saturday, one in a series of attacks targeting precisely America's racial and, in other cases, religious diversity, highlighted once again the importance of the questions posed in the book. At the same time, the ongoing mainstreaming by prominent politicians and pundits of some of the ideas and conspiracy theories that appear to have motivated the shooter illustrate the difficulties faced by the defenders of liberal democracy. Today's proceedings will unfold as follows. Present this book. Yascha is, among other roles, associate professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University and the founder of Persuasion. He's the author of numerous books and articles, including the 2018 book, The People versus Democracy: Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It, which he also presented here at AEI. If today's conversation doesn't quite suffice for you, you can find the video on the AEI website. After that, we'll hear comments from our three discussants, to whom I'm sure Yascha will want to respond. Our discussants are Shikha, Dalmia, visiting fellow in the program on pluralism and civil exchange at the Mercatus Center, founder and editor of The Unpopulist. I'm also joined by two of my esteemed colleagues here at AEI. Nick Eberstadt is the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy, while Yuval Levin is the director of our Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Department. After all that, we'll chat a bit more amongst ourselves and take a number of audience questions. We plan on ending the conversation around 1:30. Please submit your questions to john.kearns@aei.org. That's KEARNS, or via Twitter with hashtag AskAEIEcon. With that, Yascha, welcome. Thank you for doing this. Please take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Stan, for the generous introduction and for organizing this event. I'm really looking forward to the comments from these wonderful panelists today and to think together about this book. So I just want to lay out the basic ideas in the book. The core of the argument is that what we're doing today in the United States, in Germany, where I grew up, in the Netherlands, where Stan is from, in Australia, and in certain ways in Brazil and India and so many other parts of the world, is a historically unique experiment. But there's something new about this. In history, there have been many very homogeneous democracies that at the moment of their founding had a lot less ethnic and religious diversity than they have now. And there have been a lot of democracies that were very diverse at the moment of their founding, as was the United States, but which used to give a special standing and special privileges to one ethno-religious group to the exclusion, sometimes to the terrible exclusion, as in the case of chattel slavery, of other groups. And this was the case for the United States. What we're trying to do now in many countries is to build deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that actually treat their members as equals. And in part because the extent of diversity in many of these countries was not planned, in part because in many cases it was the unintended consequence of policies aiming for completely unrelated goals, we don't really have the recipes for how to do this. And so what I do in the book, what I want to do very briefly today, is to talk to three things. One, why it is actually very difficult to build diverse democracies and why we have to take that difficulty seriously. Two, to give a little bit of a sense of the vision of a diverse democracy that we need if we actually want citizens to commit to this project, if we want to have the vision of a society in which most people would be excited to live, which I think is a precondition on its success. And then third, outline a number of reasons for hard-won optimism, a number of reasons for thinking that precisely a recognition of the difficulty of this project can make us more upbeat about the current state of the United States, as well as many other diverse democracies, than we might otherwise be. So let me start with the difficulties. I teach at Johns Hopkins University, which is now an incredibly diverse campus, and my students pride themselves on being the most tolerant people in the world, and in some ways, perhaps they are. But when I ask them whether a hot dog is a sandwich, and have them debate that question to their puzzlement for 10 minutes, and then have them play simple games against each other afterwards, it turns out that the members of the group of people who believe that a hot dog is a sandwich start to discriminate against the members of a group of people who believe that a hot dog is not a sandwich. And this is a fundamental fact about human psychology, which I think is very important. But we find it very easy to form groups, very easy to favor members of the in-group, and very easy to discriminate in sometimes terrible ways against members of the out-group. In history, those kinds of clashes have been structured around any number of lines, sometimes lines that it is hard to understand in retrospect, like the fight between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, which was defining in medieval Europe for many centuries. But in a lot of occasions, the worst crimes of human history pitted different kinds of ethnic and religious, sometimes different national or cultural groups against each other. So we see that this human tendency to favor the in-group and discriminate against the out-group is particularly easy to mobilize along the lines of division that are so salient in our society today, around the lines of ethnicity, culture, religion, language, nationality, and so on. And then finally, as a convinced small d Democrat, I was, of course, tempted to think that democratic institutions might help us deal with those problems, and rightly understood, the institutions of liberal democracy, the institutions of a constitutional republic can, in fact, help us deal with diversity. But the core democratic mechanism can inflame tensions as much as put them to rest. In a monarchy, Stan and I don't have any power, and we each have to trust the monarch to make sure that we continue to be tolerated and be able to go around our lives in peace. So if Stan has more kids than I do, or there's more immigrants that look like Stan than immigrants who look like me, that doesn't really change my political standing. A democracy is always a search for majorities. And so in a democracy, if I used to be in the majority group and suddenly I realize that Stan has more kids and that his group is growing more quickly than mine, that makes it much easier to fall into this paranoia of what will happen once I'm no longer the majority. What kind of social transformation will that affect? So this is the reasons why it is, in fact, very difficult to build diverse democracies. And I think we can only understand the stakes we now face if we take that seriously. And yet, I want to make an argument for optimism, because here's how I tend to think about this topic. But if you start where most people start, with a certain naivete about the nature of a great experiment, saying, understandably, how hard can it be to be tolerant? How hard can it be to get along? How hard can it be not to hate your neighbor? How hard can it be not to be a bigot or a racist? Then it's very easy to look at the very real injustices and forms of discrimination and forms of disadvantage which persist in our society, and to say, well, this just says terrible things about us, and what possible reason can there be for hope? If we're failing at this simple task, then how can we possibly hope for a better future? I think if you take as your starting point the difficulty of a project that we embarked on, then you can actually end up with Hardwon optimism, saying that by comparison to so many other moments in history in which diverse societies have fallen apart in the most violent ways, by comparison to many other countries, especially non-democratic countries in the world today, and in comparison to our own history, the United States and many other democracies are doing so much better today than they were. So just to emphasize a couple of points, and I could talk about this in much more detail in the Q&A about America. In 1960, about 6% of Americans believed that it was morally acceptable for a white and a black American to marry each other. 6%. In the early 1990s, a majority of Americans still believed that it is immoral for Americans to engage in interracial marriage. Today, that figure is down to 6%. So it went from 6% of people thinking that this is morally acceptable to only 6% of people thinking that it is morally unacceptable. That is a fundamental transformation in public opinion. And we know that it's not only about public opinion, not only about social desirability bias, because the number of mixed race Americans, the number of newborns who are mixed race has gone up precipitously. It's gone up from about 1 in 33 a few decades ago to 1 in 7 now. Another interesting moment where different forms of pessimism meet is in the debate about immigration. So on the far right, you will often hear that the immigrants who are coming in to the United States today, who are majority non-white, who tend to come from Mexico, El Salvador, from Vietnam, from Kenya, are somehow inferior to Italian or Irish immigrants who came here a century ago. That is the claim. But there's something culturally, or perhaps even genetically, about them which makes it harder for them to succeed, and which explains supposedly why they're not integrating into American society. Now, in many of my circles, in the center and perhaps especially on the left, among academics and pundits and activists, that claim is rightly rejected as preposterous. But a surprisingly similar claim is often made, which is that it is true that immigrants today aren't integrating, that they're not succeeding, that they are marginalized and excluded because our society is so racist and so discriminatory that we don't really stand a chance. Now, there is discrimination, and there is racism that they have to overcome without a doubt, but that makes it all the more interesting. But when you look at the best studies on this subject, they come to a much more optimistic conclusion. In fact, immigrants today from El Salvador and Vietnam and Kenya are raising the ranks socioeconomically and educationally at about the same speed as Irish and Italian immigrants did a century ago. It's a multi-generation process, but actually the progress is about at the same speed as it was 100 years ago. And so that proves the two different forms of pessimism wrong. So I think that when we look at our society, despite its real challenges, we can actually take confidence that we have been making improvements in the last decades, and that we can continue to make further improvements by living up to the core values of our political system. So let me just very briefly speak to the vision that I outlined, which is based on the basic precepts of philosophical liberalism. And I make 4 straightforward points. The first is that in a free, diverse society, we need to give citizens 2 kinds of freedoms. We need to give them the classic freedom from the state and the tyranny of the majority. We need to make sure that all of us on the panel can criticize the government or the president without being afraid of going to jail or of other unfair consequences. And we need to make sure that if we belong to some community which worships in a way that the majority may dislike, they cannot come and try to burn down our house of worship or intimidate us in a mob-like manner. But we also need freedom from the cage of norms that our own community might impose on us. Communitarian political philosophers who think of our societies as constituted of a group of groups are wrong, because they cannot explain why it is unjust for groups to tell their members how they have to live, why we need a state that is not so powerful as to oppress us, but that is strong enough to step in when our own community might try to tell us how to live in a way that constrains our choices. The second point I make is about the model for the sort of society that we should seek to build. I think the melting pot, which is a common metaphor that people have used, is too homogenizing. It asks people to give up too much of their natural groupishness, and it doesn't recognize some of the joys of the diversity of a country like the United States. The salad bowl or the mosaic, which has often been put in its place, is too comfortable with a society in which there's no connective tissue between different groups, in which we are purely relegated to different groups without having any form of common solidarity. And so a better metaphor is that of a public park, in which I can choose to go and stay among my friends, but I can also choose to make new connections with strangers. For our society to succeed, it is perfectly fine for some communities, such as the Amish, to stay mostly among themselves. But collectively, we also need enough connective tissue to ensure that we can sustain real mutual solidarity. That brings me third to a defense of patriotism. The membership in groups of a subnational nature, ethnic, religious, and cultural groups, will always come naturally to people, and they will always remain an important feature of free and diverse societies. But precisely because of that, our cultural and civic institutions also need to encourage a form of mutual comprehensibility, a form of mutual solidarity. And we're seeing today in Ukraine how patriotism can actually be a tremendous force for good, how it can inspire millions of people to voluntarily defend their country against a terrible invasion we're witnessing from Russia and from Vladimir Putin. Now, as to the nature of that patriotism, we should reject ethnic nationalism for obvious and straightforward reasons. We should celebrate civic and constitutional patriotism, which for me as a New American citizen is a very important thing with which I identify deeply. But we should also recognize that most citizens don't care about politics as much as all of us on this seminar. That most Americans, when they say they love a country, are not thinking about the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. And so we should also recognize what I call an everyday cultural patriotism, a patriotism that's not rooted in some homogenizing account of the past, but is based on a love of American cities and landscapes, of sights and sounds and smells, of our cultural scripts, which regulate the way we deal with each other, of our celebrities and TikTok stars, which actually define the culture today. But I think is a diverse, an inclusive, a forward-looking culture. And I think we can recognize that as one of our sources of strength more than we have. And then finally, let me speak to something which is particularly relevant in light of the events this weekend. And that is that there is a pernicious theory of replacement, which has become very strong. And in some ways, the title of the book is premised on a misunderstanding in which my use of the phrase, the Great Experiment, was exploited by these replacement theories as far as I had admitted that Angela Merkel and I were planning to replace the German people. And it's easy to make fun of that theory. It's easy to push it aside. But I'm very struck by the fact that we're at a moment in which Democrats and Republicans and liberals and conservatives can basically agree on nothing in American life, but they can agree on an ambitious and large-scale projection about America's future, which is not all that different from the replacement theory. And that is that, first of all, America will in some meaningful sense be majority-minority by 2045. And secondly, that this demographic transformation is going to give a huge boost to the Democratic Party, make it much easier for the Democratic Party to win elections. I think that both of those points are wrong. It's very hazardous to make demographic projections in politics. Irish Americans vote very differently now than they did 50 years ago. And in fact, we have seen in the 2020 elections that Donald Trump was competitive because he increased the share of the vote among every non-white voter group. And Joe Biden won the election because he increased his share of the white vote significantly compared to Hillary Clinton. More broadly, I think it is a dangerous mistake to think of American society as essentially being constituted by a clash between whites and people of color. That is not sociologically how the lines of various socioeconomic and political conflicts fall. The reality as to how Latinos think of themselves, where Asian Americans fall in various debates, is much more complicated than that. And we should, in fact, beware of an account of the future in which the main dividing line will one day come to be between whites and people of color in that kind of way. I've spoken for too long, so I'll end it there. But just to reiterate, what we're trying to do is historically unprecedented. It's very difficult. Anybody who's read history knows that it could very easily go wrong. I am worried that it can go wrong, especially if our politics intrudes on the rest of society, as it might in 2024 and 2028. But when you look at the heart of society in the United States, as well as in many other democracies around the world, I also think that we can be proud of the progress we've made over the last decades and renew our commitment to making further progress on the basis of philosophically liberal principles in the decades to come.
Thank you so much, Yascha, for that great overview. I want to first go to Nick to hear his thoughts on the book and related issues. Nick, please go ahead.
Thank you, Stan, and thank you for inviting Yascha back again to the American Enterprise Institute to discuss his book. It is a pleasure to welcome to AEI a man of the left who is also a fierce champion of the open society, which is evident from this treatise. One of the virtues that I appreciate most about this book is that Yascha is able to make arguments that he disagrees with in a manner that would be recognizable actually to their adherents, which is a strong departure from the theme of the day, the flavor of the day on the left, which is simply to shout "bad dog" and to rebuke people who are due their opprobrium. I think this invitation to conversation is tremendously important and is quite hopeful. I would also say that I'm very taken by Yascha's concluding chapter, his conclusions, which strike me as not only commonsensical and humane, and for the most part persuasive, but also in a funny sort of way, independent from the rest of the book. I mean, I think you could have that as a standalone volume, which you wouldn't need the support for in the original 9 chapters of your treatise. I'll talk very briefly about some of the things I agree with in the book, and then mention a few things that I think I'd look at as cautionaries or questions for Yascha. Most importantly and forcefully, I agree with the chapter on demography not being destiny. I think Yascha nails that, and the absurd sort of implicit and forced racialist thinking, which leads to the misbegotten conclusions that some have come to in trying to look at demographic projections and their political implications. I mean, there's a wonderful book I should say there's a book with a wonderful title. The title's much better than the book, called "How the White People, how the Irish Became White People." And this tells us a lot about what happened over time with assimilation in the United States and how identities changed over time. And what happened in the past, I think, may indeed happen, prefigure what may happen in the future. I would caution that when one has such an enormous canvas, and your canvas is the entire world and more or less all of modern history, you can get a little thin in certain parts. And I was flagged in a couple of different areas, which are small but maybe worth mentioning. When you talk about South Africa and apartheid, yes, it's a racialist system, but it was set up as a racialist system of affirmative action for the Boers. They considered themselves to be poor in relation to the whites. They wanted to keep out black labor and black competition. It doesn't confute your argument, but it's a little wrinkle on it there about the nature of it. With India, when we talk about Aligarh and Koshikodzi, we're talking about 2 very different parts of India with very different peoples. The first troubled Aligarh is up in Uttar Pradesh. The second happy Koshikodzi is down in Kerala. If you talk to anybody in India and you tell them that Uttar Pradesh is troubled and Kerala is not, they say, well, what else is new? Questions or things to think about, which Yascha may or may not choose to respond to. 3 of them. First, I'd argue that all societies are diverse, whether or not the outside observers recognize it or have the focal lenses to see this. I've spent a fair amount of time examining, for example, South Korea and the Korean Peninsula. To outsiders, Koreans may all seem alike. To each other, that's not at all the case. They have enormous factional competition, sometimes animosities, and there's a deep factionalism inside this seemingly homogeneous population, which has had great portent for their fragile transition to democracy. The second caution is that the current democratic distemper in our country and other societies may have much to do with the nature of the evolved democracies, evolving from nation states elsewhere and everywhere evolving into welfare states. Just to take one very small example from the US, we have a very different welfare dependency profile for Hispanic immigrants in California and in Texas. California has a welfare state that looks a lot like European ones. Texas has a welfare state that looks like Texas. There's much less welfare dependency in Texas than in California. And this is a sensitive political topic across the United States. It looks to me as if this is a question for addressing the problems of the welfare state rather than addressing questions of the immigrants. And finally, there's a question about whether we should think of some of the failures that you're describing here really in terms of elite failure, in terms of lack of empathy, of sympathy, understanding of elites for the people that they are describing and making decisions for. I won't get into that at any length, but I will mention one thing. Bertolt Brecht, who was sort of the, what would we call him, the poet laureate of the Stasi, had a memorable poem called Die Lösung in 1953, in which he said, well, the people in charge would really like to dissolve the electorate and choose a new population. There is a tendency, I'm afraid, in too much of the intellectual community to follow Brecht's ironic admonition. Yascha is very much not part of that tendency, and I think he has a lot to teach his brothers and sisters on the left and a lot to teach the rest of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nicholas, for this really thoughtful and insightful comments. South Africa and India, I think, those are fair wrinkles, and we can discuss them over beer. Let me try and address the three sort of main questions and suggestions you have. So the first one was whether all societies are diverse, and I think that's certainly right. I've been writing for the last few days about polarization and the way in which it's increased around the world. And it's very striking to see that polarization has increased in seemingly homogeneous societies as well as diverse ones. And of course, as you're alluding to, South Korea is a great example of that. A society which is ethnically and linguistically very homogeneous, but doesn't have much migration, but does have quite a bit of religious diversity. But it's become much more polarized over the course of the last year, and that shows us those kind of internal divisions. So I'm sort of, torn between different accounts of identity, right? So there's sort of accounts of identity which are purely constructivist, which say, look, anything can be the basis of how you decide who's the in-group and who's the out-group, right? Is a hot dog a sandwich can be the basis for that. And then others which are much more primordialist and would say that, no, actually there are these ancient hatreds along the lines of ethnicity and religion, and those really are the most powerful ones. And I'm somewhere in the middle, right? I think that this tendency to form groups and discriminate against outsiders is universal, and that therefore in many situations it can be activated along lines that can seem trivial from the outside, and often has. In the United States today, the distinction between a Catholic and a Protestant does not feel that politically salient. In Northern Ireland, it has been incredibly salient for many centuries and may only become more salient in the coming years and decades. So I take that seriously. But I do think that there is a set of identities which have historically proven to be most powerful and most motivating. When you have a visual difference, right, where you see that somebody belongs to a different ethnicity, I think that is often proven to be very powerful. When you have deep doctrinal differences of faith, that has historically proven to be very influential. When you speak different languages, that has historically proven to be very influential. So I do think it's helpful to distinguish between relatively homogeneous societies in which you have much less ethnic, religious, and linguistic diversity on the one hand, and deeply diverse societies in which you have a lot more of that on the other hand. And I think the great experiment remains unique in that we haven't had many deeply ethnically and religiously diverse societies that actually try to treat the members as equal. So I think you can sustain what's special about this moment while recognizing your point, which is correct, but all societies look diverse from the inside, and all societies certainly have, if they are free, deep political divisions within them. The second question about the tensions inherent in the welfare state is well taken. There's some interesting research on Europe, which suggests that there's an inverse relationship between the generosity of a welfare state and the success of immigrant integration. That might seem paradoxical at first, because you might think the more of a welfare state there is and the more people have opportunity and can get access to education and have a social safety net, the easier it should be for them to take part in society. But of course, the truth of it often turns out to be that if you come into the society, there's a lot of roadblocks, including regulation, to you exercising your profession, but you have enough of a welfare state that you can sit at home and not do very much, you might end up not integrating very successfully. If you are immigrating to a society that gives you professional opportunity and that perhaps requires fewer formal qualifications, so it's easier for you to exercise a profession you did in your country of origin and so on, but you really gotta work or you're going to starve, you're much more likely to go to a place of work where you have to interact with others and learn the language and all of those kinds of things. I suspect I may be a little bit more sympathetic to a generous welfare state as a general question of policy than you are, but I think I need to recognize that there is a really complicated trade-off here in a way that some other supporters of welfare states don't recognize. And I think the empirical research plays this out. By the way, one of the huge mistakes that Europe made in the refugee crisis in 2015, 2016 was to tell millions of young men, come here, sit at home, we'll give you pretty decent standard of living, for modest, but decent standard of living by the standards of what you're used to in the society you come from, but you're not allowed to work for 2 or 3 years. And so what do the most ambitious and energetic people who don't want to just sit around do? They turn to criminal activity. What do a lot of the others do? Well, they get used to sitting around for 2 or 3 years. And once you've done that, it's much harder to then have a get up and go and actually reinvent yourself and so on. It's the moment you arrive in a society where that's most likely. So thankfully, and slightly unfairly, Europe seems to have learned that lesson with Ukrainian refugees at the moment, most of whom have a right to work from day one, which I think is going to lead to much better results. And finally, let me say 2 things about elites. The first is that I agree with you. You know, I'm an immigrant to this country as a Stan. We both came here for grad school at the same time. I'm struck by the fact that my social and professional circle could be a little bit more ethnically and religiously diverse than it is, but it's really very ethnically and religiously diverse, much more so than it would be in Europe, most likely. Socioeconomically, it is not diverse at all, right? Because I came here for grad school, virtually every single person I know in this country is a college graduate from a very selective university and most likely has a postgraduate degree or is headed for postgraduate study at some point when they're younger, right? And so it is very easy for them to really look down on average citizens. And I've come to think that not a logical, but a sociological precondition for believing in small d democracy is that you believe that there's something that average citizens do that actually you respect. That most of the time you're capable of reaching them with moral arguments. And a lot of the people who are in power in the country today don't believe that. And so you did not know this, but I had Brecht's poem in my book manuscript at some point, the one that you cite. And when I cut it out for length reasons, it didn't quite flow, but I had it in there. And so let me read it because it's very short. And so this is after the 1953 uprising of workers for higher living standards. He wrote, after the uprising of the 17th of June, the secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed in the Stalin Alley, stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. Would it not be easier in that case for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? It's a wonderful poem that I respect Brecht for in researching this poem as I was about to include it in the book. I also discovered something that I hadn't known, which is that Brecht did not publish this poem at the time. It was published posthumously because he did not, in fact, publicly want to criticize the Stasi, which was a little more disappointing.
Excellent. Thank you, Yascha. Well, perhaps our events team can work with you to record a German reading of the poem, set the music for TikTok so we can promote the event video. With that, Shikha, let me turn to you for your comments on the book. You're muted, Shikha.
Apologies. Thanks for having me on, Stan, and thanks for a wonderful conversation so far. I know we are running short of time, so I'm going to try and speed through my comments here. Let me begin by just saying that I not only enjoyed Yascha's book, but as a committed classical liberal or libertarian, I'm in hearty agreement with Yascha's basic project. His project is to stabilize liberal democracies that have been shaken by the rise of populist politics by redoubling on their commitment to treat individuals as individuals and not as members of some racial or religious group with an ascribed identity. He believes, and I completely agree with this, that if we give individuals the political space to keep the heritage that defines them without homogenizing them too much, as he said, and also at the same time creating a space for them to interact with each other and discover their shared humanity, diverse democracies will be able to not only survive, but flourish. I loved the public park model that he offered. That was my favorite chapter in the book, Yascha. As an alternative to the melting pot or the salad bowl models that we bicker over to accommodate our diversity. The public park is better because it is open to different people with vastly different ideas of the good life, the Hasidic Jews and the libertines, Muslims and Christians, while also bringing them out of their enclaves into a shared space where they can interact and overcome their fear of the other. At the risk of sounding churlish, I'm going to, however, dwell on two problems that I have with the book, partly to make this a more interesting conversation. One is the concrete policy proposals that are offered to get to the public park model of diverse democracy. And then the second is the narrative of diverse democracies are somehow inherently more conflict prone than allegedly homogeneous societies. And I agree with Nick that there is no such thing as a homogeneous society. So let's begin with the policy proposals first, which are actually the last part of the book. I think it would be fair to say that Yascha is a moderate progressive, but throughout the book, as Nick pointed out, he takes pains to practice what he preaches and examines both sides of the argument in an exceedingly even-handed fashion. Hence, when he offers his policy prescriptions, he also blends proposals from both the left and the right. Now, the correct blend would be a good thing, but in my view, the mix he offers is problematic not only from my libertarian standpoint, but I think also a progressive one. Now, from the left, Yascha borrows the notion of building universal solidarity by offering secure prosperity to everyone. And on this, I completely agree with him. As he puts it, poverty and economic stagnation are no guarantors of altruism, much less tolerance. Societies that are on the brink of subsistence are not generous societies. So he thinks we should not provide the secure prosperity to everyone by embracing the race-based remedies to help marginalized groups that modern-day social justice activists advocate, because that would result in slicing and dicing people based on their race, religion, and that would deepen current divides. Completely agree with that. However, what I disagree with is that he said that in order to achieve this universal solidarity, we need to embrace the old-fashioned progressive idea of universal welfare programs, universal healthcare, universal preschool, universal K-12 funding through more federal dollars in education, universal cancellation of college debt, and so on and so forth. Now, I have considerable sympathy for not using a racial litmus test for public benefits, but even if such universal programs were perfectly crafted to work as intended, and Obamacare actually does not give us reason to be optimistic, there would still be an issue of affordability for a country like America, whose national debt right now exceeds its GDP. So I'm genuinely curious to hear why Yascha did not advocate something like means-tested schemes if he's opposed to race-based remedies as opposed to universal programs. Why did he embrace such a sweeping progressive agenda if he genuinely is interested in bipartisanship, especially when something more modest is available that avoids the problems that you worry about? But my bigger worry is with what Yascha borrows from the right-wing side of the ledger in his policy prescriptions, namely immigration controls. He notes that one reason for the rise of populist demagogues is that institutions have become unresponsive to the will of their citizens. And given that 5 out of 10 people in developed democracies want to control their borders and reduce immigration levels, advocates of diverse democracies should defer to the persistent and resounding views of the majority, as he puts it, and clamp down. Now, I'm an advocate of relatively open immigration policies, have to put my cards on the table. And that's because I win that such policies are a win-win, not just for immigrants, but also natives. And the West, I believe, imposes tight border control at its peril. In fact, tomorrow I'm hosting a webinar whose title is Nativists Got Their Way and managed to seriously restrict immigration. What would happen? You should all attend that seminar. However, I understand that one has to take concerns about immigration seriously and address them and win the public over. But Yascha seems to want to give in to nativism rather than overcoming it. That, I fear, won't diffuse the nativist movement that is driving our populist politics today, but in fact, embolden it. Now, I understand why from Yascha's point of view, why this recommendation makes sense. And this is perhaps what gets to the heart of our disagreement. Yascha's thesis is that diverse democracies are more conflict prone than homogeneous ones because humans are inherently tribal or groupish. So the more groups there are, the more fault lines there will be. He further maintains that the West didn't affirmatively opt for this current level of diversity. Diversity has emerged as a byproduct of the immigration policies it has embraced due to its economic needs or humanitarian concerns. Hence, it has never really developed a coherent plan for dealing with its diversity. So we should get a grip on the current levels of diversity first before adding on more. And I know, Yascha, I'm caricaturing your very rich account, so I apologize for that. But let me lay out 2 issues that I have with this general account. The first is that although the narrative of mass immigration has become popular, the fact is that by any reasonable standards, immigration levels are not all that high. 150 years ago, about 3% of the world's population lived outside of its land of birth, and it's the same now. In America, about 14% of the population is foreign born, the same as the previous high at the turn of the 20th century, when a wave of nativism succeeded in imposing stringent restrictions. But foreign born are 20% of Canada's population and nearly 30% of Australia's, and they haven't, their nativist backlash is there, but it's much weaker than ours. Meanwhile, the country that's actually right now experiencing genuine mass immigration is Poland. In 10 days, it absorbed the equivalent of 3% of its population, and it's not yet ready to pull up the drawbridge, showing that there is just as much room for human solidarity as there is for conflict. My own personal view is that we have allowed just enough immigration for immigrants to become irritating to the native population, but not so much as to humanize them. The strongest anti-immigration sentiment is in states that have the lowest immigration levels, which are precisely not like the New York public park model that you and I both love. My second reservation is that, Yascha, you're right that liberal democratic societies, you're not right that liberal democratic societies somehow stumbled into their diversity without any plan to deal with it. Diversity isn't the source of conflict, it is the cure to conflict. In fact, explicitly so in the case of America. With Yuval sitting next to me, I'm a little bit afraid to talk about the Constitution and the founders because he's the real expert on those things. But James Madison's faction scheme in Federalist 10 and 51 actually depended on an increasing diversity to hold tyranny at bay and maintain a liberal polity. More diversity meant that there would be no permanent majority that would oppress the minority. He wanted to extend the sphere to increase the number of factions and interest groups where no one group had a clear majority and were therefore forced to collaborate based not on their ascribed identity, but their immediate interest. In a way, majority minority is what he wanted. I know it is hard to see that the scheme has worked out well in the age of critical race theory on the one hand and the great replacement theory on the other. If Tucker Carlson were around during the founder, he would have attacked James Madison as the great replacer. But if you are dismayed about our current conversation about race, imagine what that conversation would be like if America had not become, as Madison visualized, a nation of nations and admitted immigrants of various races and religions. All you would have then are three races in the country, white on the one hand and Black and American Indians on the other, with no other mediating group with any experience except that of the oppressor and oppressed. Would such an America have been more harmonious or even more deeply divided than it currently is?
All right, great. So I do think that you've misrepresented some parts of the book, to be honest, and I'll get through to the ways in which that's been the case, but it's a very thoughtful set of comments and challenges. So look, I understand why those of us, and that's everybody, I believe, in this meeting, who really want diverse societies to succeed, may feel a temptation to downplay either how new a departure most democracies in the world are now going through or how difficult that's going to be. But I think if you have a real sense of the tragedies of history, you realize that that's not intellectually defensible. And I actually think that if you want to sustain an optimism that's going to fly, not just in think tanks in DC, but in the breadth of the population, you need to start with an honest account of the difficulties of what we're trying to do. It just is the case that not every single one, but many of the worst crimes of human history, many of the worst wars and civil wars and genocides and forms of ethnic cleansing, were pitting one ethnic or religious group against others. And we know in political science that while extremely diverse societies can sometimes be more peaceful, the movement from a relatively homogeneous set of societies, from a society with relatively low ethno-linguistic fractionalization to higher levels of ethno-linguistic fractionalization, often leads to significant forms of civil conflict. And I think if we want to ensure that this does not happen in the United States and many other democracies around the world, we just need to take the things that make this moment different seriously. Now, you were saying that immigration levels are not that high, and then went on to cite a whole bunch of stats which show that they're really high, which show that in the United States, we are in fact now at record levels of the number of foreign-born people in the country, and that those levels are likely to increase above that level in the coming years. You also cited that through virtually all of Western Europe and Australia and a number of other important developed democracies in the world, we are now at record levels of people who are foreign-born, and interestingly, in many of them, at levels which are higher than the United States has ever been, right? So in Australia, you now have more foreign-born people than you have ever had in the United States. And actually in countries in Europe that both don't have a long history of immigration and still don't truly think of themselves as immigrant societies, and aren't easily perceived as immigrant societies from the American vantage points, like Switzerland and Germany and Sweden, we are now at or above the level of foreign-born people in the United States. So that just is a new situation where we need to confront, I think, in a serious and earnest manner. Now, Federalist 10 is also one of my favorite texts that I teach in every class where I can reasonably get away with assigning it. I think to say that Madison would have wanted a majority-minority America is exactly wrong, because part of what the majority-minority America implies is once again the existence of two groups, right? It's once again to split America into these two salient groups in a way that precisely would create two factions. That is my concern with the entire framework of how so much of the American political class describes the current reality of the United States, or sometimes seems to project, sometimes seems to desire the future of the United States. Our system of government is based on multiplying the number of factions. But one of the dangers at the moment is that ethnic polarization will reduce the number of factions, so that people are primarily defined by the membership in one ethno-cultural supergroup. And in the language of some of the progressive people in this country, but ideally we're going to think of whites and people of color, and those are two super factions. That is actually exactly the opposite of what Federalist 10 intended. So speaking to some of the more specific implications for public policy, I tend to favor considerable levels of immigration, and I tend to favor considerable levels of immigration going forward. And that's why I think you just misrepresent what's in the book. I also think that in a democracy, you can make the argument very strongly for policies that a majority of people disagree with. You have to retain the faith that you may be able to persuade them. But I also think that it is a big mistake to impose policies that a majority of the population rejects. So I'm perfectly happy to join you in arguing, and we can talk about the details, in, for example, a very generous policy towards high-skilled labor from all around the world coming to the United States. I do think that's something that's going to continue to make America more dynamic, and that is going to have a lot of benefits for everybody in the country. But if we are not able to persuade a majority of the population of that, then I think it's very perilous to impose those policies on them. Because as somebody who's been analyzing the rise of populist political movements for a long time, I think the feeling that so many people have gotten in countries where they say huge majorities of population is for immigration policies that I personally may not agree with, but the politicians don't listen to us anyway. So let's vote for these people who are at least promising to go in and mess up the system and do what we want, becomes very, very high. So all I'm saying in the book, it's not to have lower levels of immigration, it's to not systematically go against clear and sustained majority preferences against more immigration, but to make the political argument for the benefits of certain forms of immigration and hope that you can win that, but defer to the popular will on those questions if we're not able to do that. That's the core of our disagreement. We can talk a little bit about means-tested policies and so on. I'm just to say I'm not for the cancellation of student debt in the United States. I'm very in favor of charter schools in the right kind of forms. I do think there should be obviously universal K-12 education that is funded by the state. I don't think it needs to be run by the state. I favor European forms of healthcare, not along the lines of the NHS, but ones with forms of private insurance that are somewhat subsidized by employers. Whatever, we can get into the detail, but just to say, I think you can have universal coverage for a lot of the main risks to people's prosperity and to allow them to be risk-taking and entrepreneurial without it having to be a state-run system that is stifling of innovation.
Thank you, Yascha. Finally, let's go to Yuval. Yuval, as we discussed, we can go over by a bit, so don't cut yourself short. Please go ahead.
Well, I appreciate it, Stan. I do want to be mindful of the time, and so I'll try to be as quick as I can be. First of all, I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to participate in this conversation, which has been wonderful, and grateful, Yascha, for this book, which taught me a huge amount and which I think is an enormously important piece of work, full of hope and practical wisdom. It's really, everybody should read it. To advance our conversation, let me point to a couple of points that stopped me short in the book. And some of these pick up on a few things that Shikha has said with relation to the American situation in particular. And my thoughts really will focus on the applicability of the argument of the book to the American situation. This is a book with a global vision, and it addresses itself particularly to the circumstances of Western Europe. I think that is to societies that have established themselves as democracies, as thriving, legitimate, cohesive, relatively cohesive democracies, but now have to confront a transformation into something more like diverse democracies, a demographic transformation that's unprecedented in their histories and exceptionally challenging. I think that's just not really the American situation. The United States, as Shikha suggests, it's always been a diverse democracy in a sense, more diverse than democracy through its history, but very diverse. And for a century now has been a very diverse democracy. In some respects, it is less so now, not more than it used to be. Certainly, as Shikha suggested, if you look at the immigrant share of the population, it's not only that at the peak in 1920, it was about as high as it is now, it was about that high from 1870 until 1920. In the census of 1870, the portion of foreign-born residents in the United States was 13%. That's just about where we are now. And that's not to say it's not problematic, but that it's not new. And the United States did go through a period of very low immigration between the 1920s and the 1970s, but that was exceptional, a long exceptional period which we have come out of. And we have a lot to draw on in our own history in a way that I think makes us pretty different from some of the other diverse democracies we might think about. That is not to say that American democracy doesn't confront unprecedented challenges in this moment. I think it does, but that they're somewhat different from the challenges of demographic transformation that are confronting parts of Europe. American society really isn't being transformed demographically in that sort of way. And I don't think that the ways in which it is being transformed are what we find reflected in our politics. Our divisions, in a sense, are more cultural. And in that respect, they're distinctly, I would say in a distinctly American way, they're more ideological than they are demographic. The premise of the book is that it's not different views so much as different identities that threaten diverse democracies. And I think that's not quite as good a fit for the American situation as the European one. In a sense, if you think about our problem being polarization, a division into two, in what way are we really divided into two? The answer is we're divided into two parties. And that's a function in part of our electoral system. It's a function in part of the way that our culture is developed. But we're not divided into two culturally. And the division that you point to of whites and people of color, which in some ways some progressives would like to be the way we're divided, just isn't the way we're divided. That's not how our polarization works. There are a lot of whites on both sides of the polarization that we're living through in American life. And they're a majority of both parties. Obviously a larger majority of the Republican side, but that division into two, which is our culture war, I think is not quite on the model of the diverse democracy example that you point to. And that has a few consequences, because I would also say that our political tradition in America has a distinct way of dealing with group differences, distinct from other democracies. Our institutions are built to moderate and channel factional divisions. Now, those institutions are not working very well right now, to put it mildly, but they stand as answers to the question that we're asking ourselves now, the question of how a divided, diverse democratic society could govern itself. And that means that for Americans, the way forward can look something like a constitutional restoration, which is a little bit easier to imagine than a constitutional transformation of the kind that some other advanced democracies would require to deal with their diversity. In a sense, one advantage that we have is that the ideal that we are failing to live up to is actually fairly sophisticated about the demands of sustaining a diverse democracy. It's fairly sophisticated about the psychology of social division, too. Our ideal is not a homogeneous classical polity, but rather takes for granted both the fact of moral diversity and the need for subsidiarity. And so I think the problem we face, while very serious, is a little different than the one that this book describes. And in that sense, I would also say that at least in the American experience, we don't face the stark choice between liberal individualism and a more communitarian politics that the book describes. Yascha suggests that we need to choose between liberalism and communitarianism. But the American system has always been a combination of the two, a mix of liberalism and republicanism. I think our Constitution embodies that combination. Our history describes it. It is achievable. And it's an answer to precisely the question that this book formulates so well. But it's an answer because our differences are more ideological than identitarian. And that means that a system that allows for more communal differences would not divide along the lines that divide our society in two, and would allow us to have more diversity, more constructive diversity. A final quibble, Yascha offers the metaphor of a public park to describe a liberal society. And at first glance, I found it sort of beautiful, but a park is a setting. A park is an environment in which we act. I think a nation is more like a caste. It's a group of people who act together. And when you think about the melting pot or the salad bowl, that's about what happens in the bowl. It's about different ways of organizing the people within it. It's not about the bowl. It's not about the setting. And I think a nation understood as a caste can have tremendous diversity and should, but it should also have layers and levels. It should also have some defining characteristics as a whole. It's one whole people with a character. So I think of it not as a place, but as a people, an answer to the question, not where, but who. And in that sense, I'm less hopeful about the possibilities of the public park metaphor. But let me end with a word of praise about what I think is maybe the most important overall facet of the book, which is just its sheer hopefulness, which I think is well-grounded, it is justified, and is also very important as a model of how to think about our problem. And I say hope because I think, Yascha, in the book, you describe it as optimism. You did it here in this discussion too. And I think hope actually is not optimism, and that the difference between hope and optimism is important for the argument you're making. Hope is a virtue. And so as a virtue, I think of it as midway between two vices, two sins. On the one side is despair, the view that nothing can save us, so we might as well just give up. On the other side is what St. Thomas calls presumption, the view that everything's going to be fine. We don't need to worry. And both despair and presumption are failures. They're both sins. They're both vices. I think despair is pessimism and presumption is optimism. They're both moral errors, and midway between them is hope, which says there's reason to believe that a better way is achievable, but whether that happens or not depends on agency, on action. Maybe it's divine agency, maybe it's human agency, and I think in our situation it is human agency. And what your book says is this could work out if we act, if we understand the problem in the right terms, if we understand potential solutions in the right way, we can act to make this better. That's a very hopeful place for the book to land. And I think it's also the right place and ultimately makes the book very persuasive.
Thank you, Yuval. Yascha, go ahead, sorry.
Thank you for these really interesting and helpful comments. I've met a lot of exceptionalists in America. There's come in different stripes, but basically nobody I've ever met in America is not an exceptionalist. So there's exceptionalists who think that America is better in a positive way, and there's exceptionalists who think that America explains all the evil in the world, but everybody's an exceptionalist. So I'm most of the exceptionalists that are around me are of a negative kind, who think that America is at the root of all evil. It's nice to be in conversation again with somebody who's perhaps closer to a positive American exceptionalist, but even for I love this country very much and became a citizen in part because of the universal promise of America, I in fact am perhaps less exceptionalist than most Americans, and perhaps less exceptionalist than you in this respect. So to clarify the conceptual setup, I think that, let's say, Germany and the United States, two countries that I know well, come to an unprecedented challenge from different paths, but they find themselves in the same place now. So it is absolutely true that a country like Germany used to be much more homogeneous than it is now, and not coincidentally manages to found its first successful democracy in the post-war period at a time when the country had come to be much more homogeneous than it had been previously. And so it now needs to reinvent itself in light of a diversity that has grown. They sort of managed to get the democracy there first, and now they're trying to figure out how to deal with the diversity. The United States, you're absolutely right, is different in the sense that it has always been diverse since its founding. It's not entirely unique in that. The same might be true of Canada in certain respects, certainly of countries like India or Brazil. But what it wasn't was an inclusive democracy, right? At the time of the founding, the United States, of course, excluded a whole vast swath of groups, including women at the time and Native Americans, as well as many others, but in particular African Americans in the most extreme way. And so what both Germany and the United States are now doing for the first time is to try and sustain these deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that treat all members as equals. And perhaps Germany started off treating most members of a society as equals because they weren't very diverse. The United States started off having a lot of diversity, but not treating them as equals. What's shared now is the novelty of that situation. Now that makes certain differences, and I talk in the book about the historic modes of failure of different societies. I would say that the United States used to have a form of hard domination. Countries in Western Europe used to have a form of soft domination, in which the reality of exclusion was there, even though it was not explicitly in the law. And that does mean different challenges today to some extent. But I do think that's integrated into the book, that the United States is less exceptional than perhaps you say, and that it's not clear to me that America has the recipes in so much more obvious a way than Europe. I would say that America needs evolutionary change, and Europe also needs evolutionary change. I think the constitutions in France and Germany and so on certainly are capable of dealing with diversity if they are amended in certain minor ways and applied in thoughtful ways. And the same is true in the United States. On liberalism and communitarianism and republicanism, which perhaps we can discuss offline, I was puzzled why you brought that in, because republicanism to me is orthogonal to those two categories. I don't think that communitarianism is the same as republicanism at all. I think that we have more conceptual work to do than you suggest in two respects. First, my chapter on liberalism is in part an internal critique of liberals, because I think that sometimes philosophical liberals are too tempted by a comprehensive liberalism, which says the world is going to be fine when everybody defines as an individual and does not give great importance to their ethnic and religious and cultural groups, and becomes like the sort of people that most of us on the call probably are, who are quite self-inventing, quite driven by our professions and by intellectual debate and so on. And I was trying to remind liberals that a very important part of their tradition is the recognition of the importance of groups. And the reason why certain rights are fundamental to the liberal tradition, but not others, are rooted in a recognition of the importance that these things have for people. Why is freedom of worship and freedom of assembly why are these such quintessential liberal virtues? Because we realize that for most human beings, their religion and their fellowship with a particular set of people who belong to their culture is especially important and is worthy of special respect from the state and the collectivity. So that's very important. I do think that there is a danger of communitarianism today as well. And that often does take the form of ethnic boundaries in particular. When I look at many of the elite private schools that some of you on the call and many of you watching on YouTube may be sending your children to in Washington, D.C. and New York City, and I see teachers form affinity groups of children at the age of 10 or 8 or 6. So we're not talking here about teenagers self-determining and saying, I want to be part of a cultural club. We're talking about children who are being assigned by their teachers into separate groups on the basis of the color of their skin, in order to communicate to them that the most important thing about them is their being African American, or their being Asian American, or their being Latino, or their being white. I do think that we are culturally in danger of falling into a form of communitarianism, which defines us not as American citizens with rights and duties that will exercise in belonging to groups, but as essentially members of groups, and as society being a confederation of these competing groups in ways that I think are really dangerous to the liberal project. And so I would just say on that particular point that I mean, the danger of communitarianism in the United States, of misunderstood communitarianism, is perhaps more vivid than you imagine in your remarks. But last, let me end on a moment of agreement and puzzlement. Agreement, because I think we actually think about a fundamental question about American polarization at the moment in the same way, and puzzlement as to why you seem to think that we disagree on it. And that is that I think it's absolutely right that, again, pundits who say that the fundamental division in America today is between whites and people of color are not just wishing for something that would be pernicious for society, they're also misdescribing the nature of our society. The fundamental division in American society is between Democrats and Republicans, right? It's between these super factions of hostile political parties. And so the thing that I'm optimistic about, despite the fact that it's a very hard challenge, is our ability in the United States to sustain deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies, in being able to have people from these very different origins and different ethnicities feel a common nationhood with each other, feel solidarity with each other. Where I'm very worried is that the partisan polarization between Democrats and Republicans, in particular in the form of a Republican Party that doesn't accept basic things like how we decide who gets to govern, is going to tear the country apart in terrible ways. So I agree with you that the reason why this book is optimistic is that I think we can make these inter-ethnic and inter-religious conflicts work. Where I share your pessimism is in the fact that it's hard to know whether we can make our partisan conflict work. So I wouldn't disagree with your description of the nature of that polarization, and precisely because of that, I'm more optimistic about the state of our ethnic and religious diversity today in the United States than many other people might be.
Thank you so much, Yascha. Obviously, when I put this panel together, I probably should have blocked off 4.5 hours for the conversation. But thank you all for moderately sticking to your assigned time windows. I very much enjoyed this. I want to once again tell people to consider buying and reading the book. I think it's very interesting, as you've probably learned through this conversation. I do want to highlight for any of my fellow Dutchmen, there is a string of completely unprovoked attacks on consociationalism in the book that surprised me a little bit, but it's the price we have to pay. Anyway, with that, thanks everyone. Thanks to our audience for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.